I borrowed your old ring for the gala, Grandma. Hope you don't mind." The text message arrived at 4:17 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in November. My phone, an outdated model that my daughter-in-law, Bianca, often mocked as a relic of the Stone Age, vibrated against the polished mahogany surface of my vanity table. I picked it up, adjusting my reading glasses, and stared at the pixels glowing on the screen. The words were casual, flippant even, punctuated with a smiling emoji that seemed to mock the very concept of consent. For a moment, the world outside my window ceased to exist. The gray Atlantic waves crashing against the cliffs of our Hamptons estate, the wind howling through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It all fell silent. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, a sound like a distant war drum signaling the end of a very long, very quiet truce. Bianca hadn't asked. In 10 years, she had never asked. She took. She consumed. She discarded. To her, I was Eleanor Sterling, the 74-year-old widow living in the East Wing, a lingering artifact of a bygone era, too senile to notice her possessions migrating, too weak to protest her erasure. She believed I was a ghost haunting my own home, invisible until I was in the way. But ghosts have a distinct advantage, one that Bianca, in all her calculated ambition, had failed to consider. Ghosts see everything. I typed my reply with fingers that did not tremble. "Have fun, dear. You will look stunning." I hit send. I watched the delivery status change to delivered. Then, I placed the phone down and picked up the secure landline, the heavy receiver feeling cool and substantial in my hand. I dialed a number I had memorized 3 decades ago. "Arthur," I said the moment the line connected. My voice was low, steady, devoid of the tremor I usually feigned around my family. "The trap has been triggered. Item number 409, the Rose of Provence, has been removed from the master vault without authorization." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Arthur Pendergast had been my late husband's attorney and closest confidant for 40 years. He knew the weight of what I was saying. He knew that item 409 was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a 5-carat pink diamond commissioned by Cartier in 1925, insured for $4.5 million, and legally registered as a high-security asset of the Sterling Trust. "Eleanor." Arthur's voice was gravelly, laced with a mixture of professional caution and personal concern. "Are you absolutely certain? Once we execute Protocol Red, there's no turning back. This isn't a warning shot. This is a nuclear option. It will destroy her public life. It will humiliate Julian. It will tear the family apart." I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. I saw the silver hair, the lines etched by grief and time, the softness that people mistook for fragility. But beneath that, I saw the steel that Richard Sterling had fallen in love with 50 years ago. I saw the woman who had helped him build a real estate empire from a single tenement building in Queens. I saw the matriarch who had silently endured a decade of psychological abuse to protect her son from the truth of his own poor judgment. "I am certain, Arthur," I replied, my eyes hardening. "She didn't just take a ring. She took my dignity. She took my history, and she thinks she is untouchable. Send the police to the Pierre Hotel. The charity ball has just begun." "It is done," Arthur said. "I will meet you at the precinct with Miller." I hung up the phone and stood, walking over to the window. The rain was lashing against the glass now. Somewhere in Manhattan, Bianca was walking a red carpet, wearing my history on her finger, smiling for cameras, believing she had gotten away with it. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling. "My name is Eleanor Sterling. To the world, I am a recluse. To my family, I am a burden. But tonight, I am the executioner." To understand why I made the call that ended my daughter-in-law's life as she knew it, you have to understand the 10 years of silence that preceded it. Silence is a heavy thing. It accumulates like dust in a closed room, layer upon layer, until it chokes the air out of your lungs. Bianca entered our lives like a hurricane wrapped in silk. My son Julian met her at a gallery opening in Soho. He was 36, a brilliant but soft-hearted architect who had always lived in the shadow of his father's colossal personality. He craved validation. He craved a partner who would make him feel powerful. Bianca, a 32-year-old former runway model with a sharp jawline and sharper instincts, saw him not as a man, but as a target. From the moment she stepped across the threshold of Sterling Manor, she began her campaign of erasure. It wasn't blatant at first. It was a slow, methodical chipping away of my presence. It started with the decor. "Eleanor, this furniture is so heavy," she would say, wrinkling her nose at the Edwardian antiques Richard and I had collected across Europe. "It feels like a mausoleum in here. We need light. We need modern." Julian, desperate to please her, agreed. Bit by bit, my history was moved to the attic, replaced by cold, sharp-edged Italian furniture that looked beautiful but offered no comfort. Then it was the staff. She fired Mrs. Higgins, the cook who had been with us for 20 years, because her presentation wasn't Instagram-worthy. She replaced the gardener because he was too chatty. She installed a staff of cold, efficient strangers who looked through me rather than at me. But the worst was how she treated me. To Bianca, I was a prop. When guests came over, I was trotted out as the eccentric grandmother, smiled at, and then swiftly dismissed. "Eleanor, go to your room now. The adults are talking," she would whisper, pinching my arm with a smile plastered on her face. "You're confusing the guests. I wasn't confusing anyone. My mind was as sharp as a razor, but I played the part. I realized early on that Julian was blindly in love. If I fought her, if I complained, she would twist it. She would make me look like the jealous, overbearing mother-in-law. She would force Julian to choose, and I was terrified that he would choose her. So I became invisible. I became the silly old woman. I endured the dinners where she spoke about me in the third person while I sat right there. I endured the Christmas mornings where she opened diamond earrings funded by my late husband's estate and handed me a pair of fuzzy socks. I endured the hushed conversations I overheard in the hallway. "We have to do something about her, Julian," I heard her say just last week. "She's wandering, she's losing things. It's dangerous. The Pinecrest facility has a bed opening next month. It's for her own good. And think of the space we'd have. I could finally turn the East Wing into my studio." That was the moment the camel's back broke. It wasn't just greed. It was a calculated plan to declare me incompetent, to lock me away in a facility, and to seize control of the Sterling Trust. She was gaslighting Julian into believing I was senile, so she could legally strip me of my rights. What Bianca didn't know was that Richard Sterling was a paranoid man, a brilliant man, but paranoid. He didn't leave his fortune to Julian directly. He left it in a trust, controlled solely by me until my death. And he built this house with secrets. Behind the oil painting of the Hudson River in my bedroom was a biometric safe. Inside that safe was not just jewelry, but the deeds, the bonds, and the damning evidence of everything happening under my roof. I had hired Detective Miller 6 months ago when I first noticed small items disappearing. A silver letter opener here, a pearl brooch there. Bianca was testing the waters. She was stealing small things to see if the old bat would notice. When I didn't react, she grew bolder. But taking the Rose of Provence? That was hubris. That was the act of a woman who believed she had already won. 2 hours after the text message, the sirens wailed. I sat in the library, a book open on my lap that I wasn't reading. The television was on, muted, tuned to the local news channel. Breaking news, scandal at the Pierre Hotel. The banner flashed in urgent red. I turned up the volume. A reporter stood in the rain outside the hotel, breathless. Police have raided the annual Fall Charity Gala in a shocking turn of events. Sources say Bianca Sterling, wife of prominent architect Julian Sterling, has been taken into custody regarding the theft of a high-value diamond. The camera cut to shaky footage captured by a bystander. There she was, Bianca in a gold lame dress that hugged every curve, her hair perfectly coiffed, being marched out by two uniformed officers. Her hands were cuffed behind her back. Her face was a mask of mascara-streaked horror. She wasn't strutting now. She was stumbling. Behind her, Julian was running, his tuxedo disheveled, shouting at the police. "Wait, there's a mistake. She borrowed it. Let her go." I watched my son's desperation and felt a pang of sharp, maternal pain. He was a good man, but he was weak. He had allowed this monster to grow in our home because he lacked the courage to prune the weeds. Tonight, he would have to learn the hardest lesson of his life. The phone rang. It was Julian. "Mom, pick up!" "Mom, my God," I answered, keeping my voice trembling and confused. "Julian, what's happening? I'm watching the news. Why is Bianca in handcuffs? Mom, you have to tell them." Julian sounded like he was hyperventilating. "The police say she stole the ring, the pink one. She said she texted you. She said she borrowed it. You have to call the station and tell them it's a misunderstanding." I took a deep breath. "Julian, listen to me. Bianca texted me saying she borrowed an old ring. I assumed she meant the costume jewelry in the guest room. I had no idea she had broken into the master vault." "The master vault?" Julian paused, the confusion evident in his voice. "Mom, we don't have a master vault." "You don't," I corrected him gently. "I do. Your father installed it 30 years ago. It requires a biometric scan and a code." "Bianca didn't just borrow a ring, Julian. She cracked a safe. And that ring isn't a trinket. It's the Rose of Provence. It's insured for $4.5 million. Taking it is grand larceny. Silence. Absolute crushing silence. "4 million?" he whispered. 4.5, I said. "And Julian? That's not all. You need to come home. Arthur is here. Detective Miller is here. There are things you need to see." I hung up. When Julian arrived an hour later, he looked like a man who had walked through a war zone. He was soaked from the rain, his tie undone, his eyes wild. He burst into the library where Arthur and Detective Miller were waiting. "What is going on?" he demanded, looking from the stern-faced lawyer to the private investigator. "Why is there a PI in our house?" "Mom, Bianca is in a holding cell. She's terrified." "Sit down, Julian," I said. My voice wasn't the wavering voice of his elderly mother. It was the voice of the CEO's wife. It was a command. He blinked, startled by the tone, and sank onto the leather sofa. Arthur stepped forward. "Julian, what we are about to show you is difficult, but it is necessary. Your wife has been under surveillance for 6 months." "Surveillance?" Julian looked at me, betrayal in his eyes. "You spied on her?" "I investigated a thief," I corrected. "Detective Miller, show him." Miller, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, placed a thick file on the coffee table. He opened it, revealing a spread of high-resolution photographs. Julian leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What are these?" "That is your wife entering Gold and Loan on 47th Street, Miller explained, pointing to a photo. "That is her meeting with a known fence for stolen luxury goods in Brooklyn. And that is her selling your mother's antique emerald brooch, the one she told you was lost by the cleaning staff." Julian picked up the photo, his hands shaking. "No, that brooch. She said the maid stole it." "We fired the maid. You fired an innocent woman," I said softly. "Bianca sold it for $12,000. She used the cash to pay off a credit card debt she hid from you." Miller flipped the page. "We have documented 12 separate thefts over the last 2 years. Silverware, rare coins, first edition books. Total value liquidated is approximately $150,000. But Mr. Sterling, the theft is actually the least of your problems." Julian looked up, his face pale. How can it get worse? Arthur handed him a stack of printed emails because she wasn't just stealing assets, she was planning a coup. Julian took the papers. I watched as his eyes scanned the highlighted text. I watched the color drain from his face until he looked gray. Subject, the Pinecrest Plan, he read aloud. His voice breaking. Attorney says we need 2 doctors to sign off on dementia. I've been moving her things to make her think she's losing her mind. She's already confused. Once we get the power of attorney, we can liquidate the trust and finally buy the villa. He dropped the paper as if it burned him. She was gaslighting you? She was trying to have you committed? She was systematically trying to erase me, Julian, I said, standing up and walking to the fireplace. She convinced you I was senile. She convinced you I was a burden. And you believed her. You let her treat me like a nuisance in my own home because it was easier than confronting her. Julian put his head in his hands. A sob ripped through his chest. I didn't know. Mom, I swear to God I didn't know. I know you didn't know about the theft, Julian. But you knew she treated me with disrespect. You knew she mocked me. You knew she isolated me. And you did nothing. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. I was a coward. I loved her, and I was afraid of losing her. And in your fear of losing her, you almost lost me, I said. You almost lost your heritage. The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire. The weight of the truth was settling on Julian's shoulders, crushing the image of the wife he thought he knew. What do we do? He whispered. We go to the precinct, I said, and we finish this. The precinct was cold, smelling of stale coffee and despair. Bianca was in interrogation room B. When we walked in, me, Julian, and Arthur, she lit up with a desperate, manic hope. She looked terrible. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a bird's nest. The arrogance was gone, replaced by raw panic. Julian, oh, thank God. She tried to stand, but the handcuffs chained to the table stopped her. Tell them your mother is confused. Tell them I have permission. Julian stood by the door. He didn't rush to her. He didn't comfort her. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at her as if she were a stranger. She didn't give you permission, Bianca, Julian said, his voice flat. Bianca's eyes darted to me. You witch! You set me up! You left that ring out on purpose! I sat down in the metal chair opposite her. I didn't leave it out, Bianca. You broke into a biometric safe. Do you know how we know? Because the safe logs every entry attempt. We have a video of you using a tool to bypass the keypad after you failed the code 3 times. You didn't borrow anything. You committed a felony. Bianca sneered, her face twisted into a mask of hatred. So what? You're going to send me to jail? I'm your daughter-in-law. I'm family. This will ruin the Sterling name. You ruined the name when you turned our home into a criminal enterprise, I said calmly. Julian stepped forward and threw the file of photos onto the table. We know about the pawn shops, Bianca. We know about the emerald brooch. We know about the maid we fired because of you. Bianca looked at the photos and went still. And we know about Pinecrest, Julian added, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. We read the emails. You were going to lock my mother away. You were driving her insane on purpose. Bianca looked at Julian, and for the first time, she dropped the act. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She sat back, a cold, hard look in her eyes. She's an old relic. Julian, she spat, look at her. She sits on millions of dollars while we live on an allowance. She doesn't need it. She's waiting to die. I was just trying to speed up the inheritance so we could actually live. I did it for us. Julian looked at her with pure disgust. You didn't do it for us, you did it for you. You wanted the villa, you wanted the lifestyle. You never loved me. You loved the bank account you thought I controlled. Bianca laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You're pathetic, Julian. You're a spineless mama's boy. Without me, you're nothing. Julian took a deep breath. He looked at me, then back at her. Maybe I was spineless, he he said. "But I'm finding my backbone today. I'm filing for divorce, Bianca, and I'm testifying against you." Bianca screamed. She lunged at the table, screaming obscenities, screaming that she would destroy us. The officers rushed in to restrain her. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the room without looking back. The fallout was immense. The Sterling scandal dominated the news cycles for weeks. But as the investigation deepened, the story shifted. The FBI got involved. It turned out Bianca wasn't just stealing from me. She'd been feeding information to a ring of thieves about other high-net-worth families in the Hamptons. She used her access to charity galas to scout security systems and identify targets. My sting didn't just catch a thief, it brought down a sophisticated fencing ring. Bianca Sterling was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for grand larceny, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. But the real story wasn't about her. It was about what happened to the people she left behind. Julian was broken for a long time. The realization that his marriage was a sham, that he had been complicit in his mother's abuse, haunted him. He moved back into the manor, into his old room. For the first few months, we barely spoke. He would eat dinner with me in silence, unable to meet my eyes. One evening, I found him in the library looking at old photo albums of his father. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever say it enough. I'm so sorry, Mom." I sat next to him. "You were blinded, Julian, but you woke up. That is what matters." "But how do I forgive myself?" he asked. "You forgive yourself by doing better," I said. "You forgive yourself by protecting this family instead of endangering it." And he did. Julian took over the management of the estate properties, throwing himself into work. He became the man Richard always hoped he would be. Serious, diligent, protective. 2 years later, the manor had changed. The cold, modern furniture Bianca loved was gone, replaced by comfortable pieces that honored the house's history. The garden was blooming again. I was in the greenhouse potting orchids when Julian walked in. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him. She was about 40 with laugh lines around her eyes and dirt under her fingernails. "Mom," Julian said, looking nervous but happy, "I want you to introduce you to someone. This is Sarah. She's the botanist leading the restoration of the wetlands project." Sarah stepped forward and extended a hand. She didn't look at my jewelry. She didn't look at the house. She looked at the orchids. "Mrs. Sterling," she said warmly, "Julian tells me you're the one who kept this species of orchid alive for 30 years. That's incredible. It's a very difficult plant to cultivate." I looked at her hands. Strong, capable hands. I looked at her eyes. Kind, intelligent eyes. "Please," I said, smiling, "call me Eleanor." Sarah was everything Bianca was not. She was grounded. She was respectful. And she loved Julian for his kindness, not his wallet. When they got engaged a year later, Julian came to me asking if he could buy a ring. I opened the master vault. I bypassed the flashy diamonds, the showy pieces. I pulled out a vintage sapphire ring, understated and elegant. "Give her this one," I said. "It belonged to your great-grandmother. It represents endurance." The wedding was small, held in the garden. There were no paparazzi, no red carpets. Just family and true friends. As I watched my son dance with his new wife, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had been invisible for 10 years. I had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed. But I had waited. I had played the long game. Bianca had mistaken my silence for weakness. She didn't understand that silence is where the roots grow deep. It is where the strategy is formed. She thought she was the queen because she wore the crown, but she never understood that the crown is just metal. The true power lies in the woman who owns the vault. My name is Eleanor Sterling. I am 76 years old, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be, standing in the light, surrounded by love that is real, watching over a legacy that is finally safe. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: Do not mistake a quiet woman for a helpless one, and never, ever touch her diamonds without asking.